I walked up my driveway to find a woman in a white BMW counting $100 bills, while my family's century-old cabin burned behind her. The demolition crew was packing up their equipment, and Patricia Manning, our HOA president, was holding what looked like a $15,000 cash payment with the kind of smile that told me this wasn't her first time watching someone's life get destroyed for profit. What she didn't know was that destroying federal property while targeting a military family during active deployment creates the kind of legal problems that turn local bullies into federal inmates. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You're about to hear how one corrupt HOA president learned that some veterans come from families where everyone carries a federal badge, and why you should never start a paper war with people who wrote the manual on dismantling criminal organizations. The smell of charred cedar and diesel exhaust hung thick in the mountain air as I stood in what used to be my grandfather's kitchen, watching this woman who'd just made the biggest mistake of her miserable life. See, Patricia thought she was bulldozing some helpless military family's cabin. Instead, she'd just declared war on what basically amounts to a federal task force disguised as Sunday dinner guests. Dad's FBI financial crimes, Mom's Treasury Department forensic accounting, my brother Jake's DEA intelligence, and me, Army counterintelligence. When your entire family specializes in taking down criminal enterprises, destroying our family legacy becomes a very expensive learning experience. Let me back up 14 months to when this nightmare started. I'm David Sterling, 29, spent 8 years in Army intelligence before I got smart, and took the discharge to Colorado mountains. My great-uncle Edmund left me this little cabin on what I thought was just another quiet lake in the Rockies. The old guy was always the family eccentric, lived like a hermit, but somehow had money hidden everywhere. You'll find out exactly how much money in about 10 minutes, and why that discovery changed everything. The cabin wasn't much to look at. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen that belonged in 1965. But that view, sitting on the back porch with morning coffee, watching fog rise off mirror-still water while eagles called from the peaks. That's what peace sounds like after years of analyzing enemy communications in war zones. The lake's shaped like a horseshoe, 52 acres of pristine mountain water, surrounded by 14 modest homes. Nothing fancy, just regular folks who wanted quiet retirement spots. At least that's what I thought until I met Patricia Manning. Patricia moved in 4 houses down about 8 months after me. White BMW, white teeth, white lies. Everything about her screamed, I don't belong here, but I'm taking over anyway. She's 52, runs a property management company, and married to some county planning commissioner named Richard. Within 3 weeks of unpacking, she was elected HOA president. Amazing how that works when you're the only one who actually campaigns for the job nobody else wants. My first red flag should have been how she introduced herself. I was out on the dock replacing boards on the old pier, wearing my Army PT shirt because it was hot as hell. She click-clacked down in those ridiculous heels, flashed her real estate smile, and said, "Oh, you're the military boy. Well, I hope you understand we maintain certain community standards around here." The way she said military boy dripped with enough condescension to fill the lake. But here's where the story takes a turn that Patricia couldn't have predicted. She became obsessed with my dock. Too big, she claimed, too intrusive, didn't match her aesthetic vision for our waterfront community. Never mind that 2 other docks were actually larger. Never mind that mine was probably the most well-maintained structure on the water. Patricia had decided I was the problem, and Patricia always got her way. The smell of her expensive perfume, something that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, lingered on the dock long after she left, mixing with honest scents of pine and lake water like artificial flowers in a real garden. That first violation notice arrived on a Thursday. Crisp white paper, official HOA letterhead, and enough legal-sounding threats to intimidate anyone who didn't know better. Oversized recreational structure violates community aesthetic standards per covenant 12.4c. $150 daily fine until compliance achieved. But here's what Patricia didn't know about military intelligence training. It teaches you to gather information before you react. So, instead of getting angry, I got curious. Who was this woman who thought she could order around a trained intelligence analyst on his own property? More importantly, what secrets was Uncle Edmund's little gift hiding that might change the entire game? Because if there's one thing 8 years of counterintelligence taught me, it's that the person with the best information usually wins. And something told me Patricia hadn't done her homework nearly as well as she thought. Wait until you hear what I found in Uncle Edmund's safe deposit box, and why it made Patricia's harassment campaign the stupidest decision of her life. Patricia's first major power move came while my boots were still dirty from Afghan soil. She scheduled what she called an emergency HOA meeting on a Monday afternoon at 1 p.m., when normal working people are actually working. Funny how these emergencies always seem to happen when the people being targeted can't show up to defend themselves. At this cozy gathering of 6 people in her living room, because that's how democracy works in Patricia's world, she bulldozed through something called a special compliance resolution. Our cabin was now officially deemed architecturally incompatible with established community standards that didn't exist when my great-uncle built the place. But here's where Patricia showed her true genius for bureaucratic warfare. She created a 52-page violation report. I'm not kidding, 52 pages for a simple family cabin. Our dock was excessively prominent at 14 feet by 10 feet. Our native wildflower garden was uncontrolled vegetation, disrupting neighborhood aesthetics. The fire pit my great-uncle built for roasting marshmallows. Unregistered combustible installation presenting clear and present danger to community welfare. The woman managed to turn a family retreat into a federal disaster zone on paper, complete with backdated documentation, to make it look like we'd been ignoring violation notices for months. While I was analyzing terrorist communications overseas, Patricia was manufacturing evidence like a seasoned criminal intelligence operative. When I finally returned from deployment, there was a stack of legal papers on my doorstep thick enough to stop bullets. The smell of mildew had already started creeping through the cabin windows after months of forced abandonment. That's when my training kicked in. In Army intelligence, we treat every problem like an enemy operation. Map the players, identify motivations, trace communications, find vulnerabilities. So I cleared the kitchen table and started building a threat assessment board, just like I'd done with insurgent networks in Kandahar. But this time, I was hunting a different kind of enemy, one who wore business suits instead of combat gear, and used legal documents instead of explosives. I took our case to military legal assistance, and Captain Rodriguez nearly choked on her coffee when she reviewed Patricia's paperwork. Sergeant Sterling, this is textbook violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. They can't proceed with enforcement actions against deployed personnel without following federal notification protocols. That's when I learned something crucial. There are laws specifically protecting military families from exactly this kind of bureaucratic ambush while we're serving overseas, but the real shocker came when I contacted our property management company. My parents had hired them to handle basic maintenance during deployment, but they'd mysteriously stopped all services 4 months earlier. The manager finally admitted the truth. Patricia had threatened their contractor's license unless they abandoned our property. She'd weaponized her construction industry connections to economically isolate us. Siege warfare with building permits. So I went deeper, using the same systematic approach I'd used to map enemy networks overseas. Public records, corporate filings, financial disclosures, all perfectly legal intelligence gathering. And buried in the Secretary of State database, I found pure gold. The HOA's corporate registration had expired 11 months ago. They had zero legal enforcement authority. Patricia had been running a ghost organization, like discovering your enemy forgot to actually form an army. But that discovery was nothing compared to what I found next. And you won't believe how much money was really at stake here. The beautiful irony was that while Patricia thought she was being clever, her BMW kept cruising past our property at odd hours. 1:30 a.m., 6 a.m., random weekday afternoons. The sound of that German engine became my daily reminder that she was more worried about us than we should be about her. Amateur surveillance from someone playing intelligence games against an actual intelligence professional. Meanwhile, neighbors started whispering their own horror stories. The grocery store owner confided that certain customers were mysteriously unable to get delivery services. 4 other lakefront families were facing identical harassment campaigns. Same manufactured violations, same bureaucratic timing, same intimidation tactics. You could feel the community tension, that electric anticipation, when people realize someone's finally going to fight back against the neighborhood tyrant. It reminded me of those moments before a mission, when everyone knows the operation's about to go kinetic, walking our property line with measuring tape and camera, the crunch of frost-covered pine needles under my boots sounded like preparation for battle because that's exactly what it was. Patricia had declared war on my family while I was serving my country overseas. What she didn't realize was that she'd just handed an Army intelligence analyst the perfect case study in domestic threat assessment. Every document she'd forged, every procedural shortcut she'd taken, every illegal coordination with contractors. It was all evidence now, catalogued with the same precision I'd used to track insurgent networks. The woman thought she was bulldozing a helpless military family. Instead, she'd given a federal employee a masterclass in how local corruption actually operates. 3 weeks later, Patricia escalated to what I can only describe as full-scale psychological warfare. And that's when she made the mistake that would destroy her entire operation. Patricia filed a public safety complaint with the county, claiming our dock posed an imminent drowning hazard to community children. Mind you, this is the same 14 by 10-foot dock where 4 generations of Sterling kids learned to swim without a single incident. But here's where her timing gets really interesting. She scheduled the county inspection for 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, right when normal working families would be at their jobs. Pure coincidence, I'm sure. The inspector was a guy named Carl Brennan, mid-50s, the kind of man who drives a lifted truck with chrome accessories and calls everyone buddy in that tone that means the exact opposite. What I didn't know then, but my DEA brother Jake would discover later, was that Carl had been flagged in federal databases for accepting contractor kickbacks. The man had a talent for finding structural problems that required expensive fixes from his buddies in the construction business. Like a medical examiner who only finds causes of death that benefit the funeral home paying his golf membership. I'd set up trail cameras around the property, perfectly legal on your own land, and a habit you develop when you've spent 18 months watching for insurgent activity. The footage was better than any crime thriller. Patricia and Carl walking our dock 3 days before the surprise inspection, measuring, photographing, having what looked like a very detailed conversation about structural integrity. The smell of his cheap cologne mixed with lake water would have been funny if it wasn't so obviously criminal. You learn to notice these details in intelligence work. When people are trying to look official while doing something completely corrupt, their tells become obvious. During the official inspection, Carl spent exactly 6 minutes examining our dock before declaring it structurally compromised and dangerous to public safety. His report claimed the support posts showed advanced deterioration and imminent collapse risk. Funny thing about that, the dock had been professionally inspected and certified just 4 months earlier by a licensed marine contractor. But Carl's version made it sound like we'd built a death trap out of matchsticks and hope. That evening, I called a family council of war. First time we'd all been together since my deployment, and the dining room felt electric with focused anger. Dad brought his FBI case files methodology. Mom had her Treasury Department financial forensics mindset. Jake came armed with DEA database access and a very particular set of skills for investigating people who abuse official authority. But what happened next changed everything, because that's when we discovered exactly how much money Patricia was really after, and why our little cabin was worth killing for. This is textbook racketeering, Dad said, spreading Carl's inspection report across the table. Using official processes for personal financial gain, coordinated with multiple actors. We're looking at federal RICO violations if we can prove the pattern. Mom was already pulling property tax records on her laptop. Patricia's been claiming adjacent properties as abandoned or condemned to reduce her own tax assessments. She's literally profiting from harassing her neighbors. That's when I learned something that would have been useful earlier. When local officials fabricate property problems, they often manipulate tax assessments to benefit themselves financially. But Jake dropped the real bombshell. He'd run Carl through DEA databases and found something beautiful. The man had been involved in a 2018 bridge collapse that killed 3 people. His inspection license should have been permanently suspended, but somehow he was still operating illegally. The man conducting safety inspections was himself a safety hazard who'd already gotten people killed. Emergency inspections require specific statutory authority under Colorado law, Jake explained, while printing database records. Most HOA emergencies aren't actually legal emergencies. They're just manufactured urgency to bypass proper procedures. But that wasn't even the biggest discovery. Mom's Treasury Department training had uncovered something that made Patricia's harassment campaign look like small-time crime. Hidden in a maze of shell companies and legal entities, we found Uncle Edmund's real legacy. The eccentric hermit had purchased 847 acres of prime mountain land in 1987, including mineral rights that were now worth $47 million. Our little cabin sat on the access point to what geologists had recently confirmed was one of the largest lithium deposits in North America. Patricia wasn't just trying to steal a family cabin, she was trying to steal a fortune in mining rights that she'd somehow discovered through her property management connections. The woman had been planning this theft for 3 years, systematically targeting every property owner who stood between her and a $47 million payday. Now you understand why she was willing to commit federal crimes to get our cabin, and why her next move was so desperate that it handed us everything we needed to destroy her. The next morning, Patricia showed up with a construction crew, claiming she had authority to immediately secure the hazardous dock for public safety. Picture this: 7 guys with chainsaws and sledgehammers ready to demolish property without a warrant, based on an inspection conducted by an unlicensed fraud who'd already killed people with his incompetence. This is where military training becomes very useful in civilian life. I stepped onto that dock, the supposedly dangerous, structurally compromised dock, and calmly informed them that they were trespassing on private property without legal authority. Everything recorded, everyone polite, but absolutely firm. "Ma'am," I told Patricia, "you're welcome to call the sheriff if you believe you have legal authority here. I'll wait." The look on her face was priceless, like someone who just realized their bluff got called by someone who actually knows the rules. You could hear the tension crackling like electricity before a thunderstorm. Her construction crew looked around nervously, probably wondering if destroying property based on fraudulent inspection reports was worth their hourly wage. The sound of chainsaws going silent was sweeter than any victory song. That's when I knew we had her. Patricia had escalated from paperwork harassment to attempted property destruction, based on fabricated evidence. She'd just handed us enough federal crimes to keep prosecutors busy for months. 4 weeks later, Patricia went completely nuclear, and her final gambit was so insane that it guaranteed she'd spend the next decade in federal prison. Using Carl's fraudulent inspection report, she somehow convinced the county to issue an actual demolition order. Our family cabin, 5 decades of memories built to last another century, was now officially condemned as an imminent threat to public safety and property values. But here's the thing about Patricia's psychological warfare. She had a real talent for timing. The demolition was scheduled for the Tuesday after Labor Day. You know, that perfect moment when families are getting kids ready for school and nobody's paying attention to local government paperwork. Maximum emotional damage, minimum community witnesses. We were all gathered at the cabin for what we thought would be a normal Labor Day barbecue. The smell of Dad's famous barbecue sauce mixing with pine smoke from the fire pit. 4 generations of Sterling men arguing about football, while the women rolled their eyes and made the real decisions. Normal family chaos, the kind that makes you grateful for the people who drive you crazy. That's when Sheriff's Deputy Martinez showed up at our door, hat in hand, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else on earth. "Ma'am, sir, I'm real sorry about this, but I have to serve you with a 72-hour evacuation notice." He handed over the paperwork with the expression of someone forced to kick puppies for a living. Deputy Martinez had served in Iraq, you can always tell, and he recognized military bearing when he saw it. "Look, Sergeant," he said quietly, "something smells fishy about this whole situation, but I'm legally obligated to serve these papers. Y'all might want to lawyer up fast. Here's what I learned about emergency demolition orders. They're supposed to require 14-day minimum notice under Colorado law, with specific judicial review for properties that pose genuine public danger. But Patricia had somehow convinced a county judge that our cabin presented such immediate peril that normal legal protections didn't apply. I immediately got on the phone with military legal assistance, treating this like the enemy action it was. Captain Rodriguez was furious when she heard the timeline. "Sergeant, this violates about 18 different due process requirements. Emergency demolitions need documented imminent danger, not just some inspector's opinion about dock safety." While I'm coordinating legal responses, my family activated like the federal task force we'd accidentally become. Dad called his FBI contacts about civil rights violations under color of law. When local officials abuse their authority to deprive citizens of constitutional rights, it becomes a federal crime. Mom launched a Treasury investigation into Patricia's construction business, because nothing says conflict of interest like hiring your own company to demolish the property you've been harassing. Jake coordinated with the sheriff's department about Carl's illegal inspection activities. Turns out 4 other counties had been wondering why their certified inspector kept finding problems that required his buddy's construction services to fix. But the real breakthrough came when Mom's Treasury training uncovered something beautiful in the property tax records. Patricia had been claiming our cabin as abandoned and condemned on her own tax filings for the past 3 years, reducing her adjacent property assessments by claiming decreased neighborhood values. She'd been literally profiting from harassing us before she even started the demolition process. She's been planning this for years, Mom said, spreading financial documents across the kitchen table like evidence at a crime scene. Every harassment action, every manufactured violation, it's all been building toward seizing this property for her own use. Then we discovered the smoking gun. Patricia's construction business had been pre-positioned to handle the demolition. She'd hired herself to destroy our property based on fraudulent inspections conducted by an unlicensed inspector who owed her money. It was like discovering the arsonist also owned the fire insurance company. That evening, while we're frantically preparing legal injunctions and federal complaints, Patricia held an emergency HOA meeting to celebrate what she called successful resolution of community safety concerns. The woman actually invited local media to document her responsible leadership in protecting neighborhood property values. The sound of her victory speech broadcast on local radio, while we packed family heirlooms, had a particular quality that reminded me of enemy propaganda. Confident lies delivered with absolute conviction. She promised the lakefront would be returned to natural beauty once the non-compliant structure was removed. Translation: available for her personal expansion plans. But Patricia made one crucial mistake in her moment of triumph. She publicly admitted to orchestrating the entire harassment campaign on record, with media witnesses, while federal agents were building a case file that already included racketeering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The taste of adrenaline during that 96-hour legal marathon was familiar. The same metallic urgency I'd felt before combat operations overseas, except this time, the enemy had just revealed their entire battle plan on live radio while standing in a minefield of federal crimes. By Thursday morning, our emergency injunction was filed, federal investigations were active, and Patricia Manning had no idea she'd just declared war on the entire United States government. The woman thought she was bulldozing a cabin. Instead, she'd built her own prison out of documented federal crimes. What happened next was so beautiful that prosecutors still use our case as a training example for how criminal conspiracies destroy themselves when they target the wrong family. Mom's Treasury Department training for financial crimes investigation turned out to be the key that unlocked everything. While Dad was building federal cases and Jake was coordinating with law enforcement, Rebecca Sterling was doing what she does best, following the money trail that criminals always think they've hidden well enough. "David, you need to see this," she said, calling me over to her laptop at 3 a.m. The dining room table looked like a command center, covered with printouts, tax forms, and corporate filings. The smell of strong coffee and the glow of multiple computer screens gave the whole scene a war room atmosphere. What she'd found was beautiful in its simplicity and absolutely damning in its scope. Hidden in a maze of shell companies and legal entities, Patricia had purchased 18 acres of prime lakefront property in 2020, right next to our cabin. The land was bought through something called Mountain Serenity Development LLC, with Patricia listed as managing partner. But here's the kicker: the development permits she'd filed with the county described a $3.7 million luxury eco-resort. You know, those fancy wilderness experiences for rich people who want to rough it with Wi-Fi and gourmet meals. Except the permit specifically noted that development was contingent on removing all non-conforming structures from adjacent properties. Our cabin wasn't just an inconvenience to Patricia, it was literally blocking her path to becoming a multimillionaire. Mom kept digging, and the pattern became crystal clear. 7 other lakefront families had been targeted with identical harassment campaigns over the past 3 years. Same manufactured violations, same inspector, same escalating pressure tactics. But here's what made it a federal crime. Patricia had been using her HOA authority to artificially create property problems, then offering to buy the problematic properties at way below market value. "This is textbook racketeering," Mum said, highlighting financial transactions on her screen. She's using official processes systematically to deprive people of property rights for personal enrichment. The FBI has an entire manual about this kind of scheme. The really beautiful part was how Patricia had documented everything herself. Her construction business tax returns showed $380,000 in suspicious consultation fees paid to various county officials over the past 4 years. Remember Carl, our fraudulent inspector? He'd been receiving monthly payments disguised as structural assessment retainers. But it gets better. Patricia's sister-in-law happened to be the loan officer at First Colorado Bank, the same bank that had pre-approved a $3.7 million construction loan for Mountain Serenity Development LLC. The whole thing was a family business designed to steal lakefront property using government authority. We'd uncovered what federal prosecutors call a criminal enterprise. Multiple people using their official positions in a coordinated scheme to commit crimes for profit. The HOA harassment wasn't personal. It was just the retail end of a much larger wholesale theft operation. Look at this timeline, Dad said, connecting the dots between property purchases, HOA harassment campaigns, and bank loan approvals. She's been planning this for at least 5 years. Every family she's targeted owns property that blocks her development plans. That's when I realized why my Army intelligence training had been so useful in fighting this. Patricia wasn't just a corrupt HOA president, she was running a sophisticated criminal conspiracy that required mapping networks, following money flows, and understanding how multiple bad actors coordinate their activities. But wait until you hear what she did when she realized we were closing in on her operation, because her panic response was so stupid that it guaranteed life sentences for everyone involved. The power dynamic had completely shifted. 48 hours earlier, we were a military family trying to save our cabin from bureaucratic harassment. Now, we were sitting on evidence of a multi-million-dollar federal crime syndicate that had been systematically stealing property from American families for years. Patricia thought she was bulldozing our cabin to clear land for her resort. What she'd actually done was hand federal law enforcement agencies a complete roadmap to her entire criminal operation, documented in her own tax returns and corporate filings. The woman had been so confident in her local political connections that she'd forgotten something important. When you commit crimes against federal employees, those crimes get investigated by federal agencies with resources that local corruption can't reach. Wednesday morning, we weren't just fighting for our cabin anymore. We were sitting on enough evidence to shut down an entire criminal enterprise disguised as community governance. By Friday morning, our family dining room had been transformed into something that looked like a federal command center. Military-style organizational charts covered the walls, evidence timelines stretched across whiteboards, and 5 different government agencies were coordinating the takedown of what we now knew was a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. The smell of industrial-strength coffee mixed with the sound of laser printers running constantly as we prepared what Dad called the most thoroughly documented local corruption case I've seen in 31 years with the FBI. Each family member had become the lead on their area of expertise, and watching us work together was like watching a precision instrument designed specifically for dismantling criminal conspiracies. Franklin took point on the federal prosecution strategy. We're not just dealing with HOA harassment anymore, he explained, while organizing evidence into prosecution-ready files. This hits every major federal crime category: conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law, racketeering, mail fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering through the construction business. His FBI contacts in the public corruption unit were practically salivating over the case. When local officials systematically abuse their authority for personal profit, especially targeting military families, it becomes exactly the kind of federal crime that prosecutors love to showcase. The FBI manual literally has a chapter about this type of scheme, and Patricia had followed it like a textbook. Mom's Treasury Department Criminal Investigation Division expertise turned into financial warfare capabilities that would make any enemy combatant nervous. She'd identified every bank account, property, vehicle, and asset connected to the conspiracy. When we're done with the asset forfeiture process, she said with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent decades chasing financial criminals, Patricia's going to wish she'd never heard the word lakefront. The really beautiful part was how her own greed had created the evidence trail. Every bribe disguised as a consultation fee, every shell company transaction, every fraudulent expense claim, it was all documented in tax filings that she'd signed under penalty of perjury. Criminal Investigation Division has software that can reconstruct financial crimes going back a decade, Mum explained, and Patricia had been helpfully creating digital evidence the entire time. Jake coordinated the multi-agency law enforcement response with the precision of someone who'd spent years investigating drug conspiracies. Carl's fraudulent inspections don't just violate state licensing requirements, he explained, while coordinating with sheriff's departments across 4 counties. When he falsifies structural safety reports for demolitions, he's potentially violating federal explosives regulations. Every building he's condemned based on fake inspections becomes a federal crime scene. His DEA database searches had revealed that Carl's inspection fraud pattern stretched across multiple states. The man had been systematically falsifying safety reports for profit, and at least 3 people had died in that 2018 bridge collapse that he'd certified as structurally sound. Federal prosecutors were already preparing charges that could put him away for decades. My role became what military intelligence does best: comprehensive threat assessment and strategic coordination. I created detailed operational timelines, mapped communication networks between conspirators, and developed what we call pattern analysis, showing how each crime connected to the larger criminal enterprise. But here's what made this family operation truly effective. We had legitimate federal authority backing every move. When Dad's FBI team requested surveillance authorization, judges approved it immediately. When Mum's Treasury division launched asset investigations, banks cooperated without hesitation. When Jake's DEA contacts coordinated with local law enforcement, sheriff's departments treated it as the federal priority case it had become. Within a week, we had a community intelligence network that would have impressed any military commander. The retired Air Force colonel who published the local newspaper became our media coordinator. The Navy veteran who owned the engineering firm provided technical expertise and detailed property assessments. 8 targeted families became cooperating federal witnesses, each contributing evidence of Patricia's systematic harassment campaigns. Even the hardware store owner, a Vietnam veteran who'd been quietly documenting which customers were being denied building supplies, turned out to have been creating an intelligence file for 4 years. I knew something wasn't right, he said, handing over detailed records of Patricia's economic pressure tactics. Just didn't know who to call until now. The technology arsenal we assembled would have been impressive in any federal investigation: professional surveillance equipment, financial analysis software, legal research databases, and military planning applications adapted for civilian use. But the real force multiplier was having 4 family members who knew exactly which federal resources to activate and how to coordinate between agencies that don't always communicate well. By the end of week 2, we weren't just investigating Patricia's crimes, we were documenting a complete criminal enterprise with enough evidence to support federal charges against 16 co-conspirators. The woman who'd thought she was dealing with one helpless military family had accidentally declared war on a federal task force with unlimited jurisdiction and resources. The taste of inevitable victory was starting to mix with the coffee. Patricia had no idea that her entire criminal operation was now under federal surveillance, with every phone call monitored and every financial transaction tracked. By the 3rd week of our investigation, Patricia must have sensed the walls closing in. And that's when she made the kind of desperate mistake that turns racketeering charges into life sentences. Federal agents had been making routine inquiries at banks, courthouses, and construction sites. Her phone calls were being monitored, her financial transactions tracked, and her co-conspirators were getting nervous. That's when she made the classic mistake that every criminal makes when they panic. She escalated to direct action. It started with what she probably thought was subtle sabotage. Maintenance contractors began showing up at our cabin during odd hours, claiming they needed to perform routine utility inspections. Except these weren't utility workers. They were guys with tools designed for destruction, not repair. Our electrical lines got mysteriously cut, the water pump developed sudden mechanical failures, and the septic system somehow sustained puncture damage that looked suspiciously like sledgehammer strikes. The beautiful thing about military intelligence training is that you learn to anticipate enemy escalation patterns. I'd positioned trail cameras around the entire property perimeter, capturing everything in high-definition detail. The footage was better than any crime documentary. Patricia's contractors systematically damaging our infrastructure while she waited in her BMW, coordinating the operation like a general directing battlefield sabotage. You could smell the desperation in their hurried work, that particular scent of fear sweat mixed with diesel fuel and cut copper wiring. These weren't professional criminals. They were construction workers who'd been promised easy money for minor property modifications and were starting to realize they'd been recruited for federal crimes. But Patricia's real mistake was trying to intimidate federal employees. She started sending anonymous letters to our workplace security offices, claiming we posed potential security risks due to unstable behavior and abuse of government connections. The woman actually tried to trigger military security clearance reviews and FBI internal investigations by spreading rumors about the people investigating her crimes. That's when things got personal for my family, in ways that Patricia couldn't have anticipated. Threatening federal employees doesn't just violate additional statutes, it activates counterintelligence protocols designed to protect national security assets. Within 72 hours, FBI counterintelligence was treating Patricia's harassment campaign as a potential threat to federal operations. Dad's reaction was particularly satisfying to watch. She just graduated from local corruption to threatening federal agents, he said, while coordinating with his FBI colleagues. That's the kind of mistake that turns a 7-year sentence into a 25-year sentence. Meanwhile, Patricia was organizing what she called a community safety meeting to present herself as the victim of government overreach. She spread stories about how the unstable veteran family was abusing federal connections to intimidate honest community leaders. The irony was beautiful, a criminal conspiracy complaining about law enforcement investigating their crimes. Her media manipulation campaign included planting stories in regional newspapers about federal overreach and local governance. She even hired a public relations firm to craft a narrative about brave community leaders standing up to government bullying. The woman was spending thousands of dollars to publicly document her obstruction of federal investigations. But here's where her amateur hour approach to criminal conspiracy really showed. She tried to coordinate her smear campaign using the same phones and email accounts that were under federal surveillance. Every strategy session, every coordinated lie, every attempt to manipulate public opinion was being recorded by the same agencies she was trying to discredit. The escalation reached peak desperation when she attempted direct bribery of federal investigators. Patricia apparently thought she could approach one of Dad's FBI colleagues at a coffee shop and offer $30,000 to lose some paperwork related to our case. She actually handed over an envelope full of cash to an active federal agent while wearing a wire that recorded the entire conversation. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for attempting to bribe a federal officer," Agent Rodriguez said, and you could practically hear Patricia's world collapsing in real time. But even better, the arrest was coordinated to happen in full view of the coffee shop, where half the county's mourning crowd witnessed their HOA president being taken away in handcuffs. That same day, Carl, the fraudulent inspector, was arrested while trying to flee the state. Turns out, when DEA agents want to find someone, state lines don't provide much protection. Jake's coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies meant that Carl's attempted escape became a federal manhunt that ended with him face down in a Walmart parking lot in Utah. The sound of those handcuffs clicking shut, broadcast on local news and shared across social media, marked the moment when Patricia's criminal enterprise officially collapsed. Her construction business assets were seized, her bank accounts frozen, and her co-conspirators were all competing to see who could cooperate with federal prosecutors fastest. The smell of victory mixed with the mountain air that evening as we sat on our structurally dangerous dock, watching news helicopters circle overhead. Patricia had spent years terrorizing families with bureaucratic warfare, but she'd never faced anyone who knew how to fight back with the full resources of the federal government. With Carl arrested and her bribery attempt on federal record, Patricia entered full panic mode. And what she did next was so spectacularly stupid that it guaranteed she'd die in federal prison. That's when criminals always make their worst decisions, when they realize the investigation isn't going away, so they start destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses. What she didn't realize is that obstruction of justice during an active federal investigation is like pouring gasoline on a fire you're already losing control of. The first sign of her desperation came at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, when Patricia's construction company office mysteriously caught fire. Pure coincidence, of course, that the blaze happened to destroy filing cabinets containing financial records, contract documentation, and communication logs with county officials. The fire department found accelerant residue and what looked like sledgehammer damage to computer hard drives before the flames even started. But here's the beautiful thing about trying to destroy evidence in the digital age. Everything has backups, and federal investigators know where to find them. Mom's Treasury Criminal Investigation Division had already subpoenaed bank records, email servers, and cloud storage accounts. Patricia was destroying her own copies of evidence that prosecutors already had in multiple formats. "She's making this easier for us," Mom laughed while reviewing the arson report. "Now we have obstruction of justice and insurance fraud charges to add to the racketeering indictment. The woman is literally committing new federal crimes to cover up the old federal crimes." The really desperate move came when Patricia started threatening the other families who'd been cooperating with federal investigators. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes warning that continued cooperation with outside agitators will have consequences for community standing and business relationships. She was essentially threatening federal witnesses in writing, which is about as smart as leaving your fingerprints on a murder weapon. But Patricia's masterpiece of criminal stupidity was staging a break-in at her own home. She called sheriff's deputies to report that the military family had broken into her house and planted threatening materials, including what she claimed were military equipment and government surveillance devices that proved we were abusing federal authority for personal vengeance. The only problem with Patricia's false flag operation: my Army intelligence training makes you very good at spotting fake evidence. When I saw the police report, it read like a checklist of amateur mistakes. Brand new threatening notes printed on paper that still had store creases, military equipment that was actually civilian camping gear you could buy at Walmart, and surveillance devices that were smoke detectors with the labels removed. Deputy Martinez, the Iraq veteran who'd served our original demolition papers, took one look at the scene and immediately called federal investigators. "This is the worst staged crime scene I've ever seen," he told Dad's FBI team. "She planted evidence so obvious that my teenage daughter could spot it from the driveway." Meanwhile, Carl's arrest had triggered a cascade of confessions from other co-conspirators. The county commissioner who'd accepted Patricia's bribes decided he'd rather cooperate than face federal prison time. The bank loan officer, Patricia's sister-in-law, suddenly remembered detailed conversations about coordinating loans with property harassment campaigns. Even the construction workers who'd sabotaged our cabin were lining up to provide evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. That's when Patricia made her final fatal mistake. She tried to flee. Not physically, she was too smart for that. But she attempted to transfer assets to offshore accounts, liquidate properties, and create new shell companies to hide her remaining money. Every transaction was monitored by federal agencies that specialize in tracking financial crimes. "She's like a wounded animal thrashing around in a trap," Jake observed, while coordinating with DEA financial crime specialists. "Every move she makes creates more evidence and involves more federal agencies. At this point, she's got violations spanning FBI, DEA, Treasury, and probably Homeland Security jurisdiction." The surveillance footage from this period shows a woman completely unraveling under pressure. Patricia's BMW was spotted at various banks, lawyers' offices, and government buildings at odd hours as she desperately tried to find someone, anyone, who could make her federal problems disappear. The irony was that every meeting was being monitored, every conversation recorded, every financial transaction tracked in real time. Her final desperate gambit was attempting to bribe a federal judge through an intermediary. She apparently believed that if she could get the right person to talk sense to the federal court handling our case, the whole investigation would just disappear. The intermediary she chose was a former law school classmate who happened to be a federal prosecutor in another district. The phone call lasted exactly 47 seconds before the prosecutor hung up and immediately contacted federal authorities about attempted judicial bribery. Within hours, Patricia had added conspiracy to obstruct justice and attempted bribery of federal officials to her growing list of charges. By Friday evening, sitting on our supposedly dangerous dock with a beer and watching federal surveillance helicopters circle overhead, I realized something beautiful. Patricia had committed more federal crimes trying to cover up her original crimes than she'd committed in the original conspiracy. The woman had built her own federal prison, one felony at a time. The annual Lake Serenity Community Safety Meeting was supposed to be Patricia's victory lap. She'd scheduled it for Saturday morning at the community center, complete with local media coverage, and what she promised would be a special recognition ceremony for outstanding community leadership. 180 residents packed the building, expecting the usual boring HOA updates about snow removal and boat dock regulations. What they got instead was the most spectacular public downfall in Colorado local government history. Patricia had no idea that every federal agency investigating her crimes had coordinated to make this the grand finale of their case. FBI agents were positioned throughout the audience, looking like concerned citizens. DEA investigators sat in the back row with video equipment. Treasury criminal investigation agents occupied strategic positions near the exits. Even the U.S. Attorney's Office had sent prosecutors to witness what they knew would be Patricia's final public appearance as a free woman. The Sterling family entered together, with me in full dress uniform leading the way. The community reaction was immediate and powerful. Applause that started with the veterans in attendance and spread throughout the room. You could feel the energy shift as people realized this wasn't going to be Patricia's show anymore. But Patricia was still playing her role as the misunderstood community leader. She took the podium with that confident smile she'd perfected over 2 terms as HOA president and began what she clearly thought would be her vindication speech. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to address the recent unpleasantness caused by certain individuals who've chosen to use their government connections to intimidate and harass dedicated community volunteers, she began, looking directly at our family. I've always believed that Lake Serenity should be a place where honest, hard-working families can pursue the American dream without interference from outside agitators. The crowd was getting restless, murmuring among themselves, as neighbors who'd been harassed by Patricia's schemes recognized the lies being presented as community service. She doubled down, claiming credit for removing safety hazards and non-compliant structures that threatened property values and family safety. That's when I requested permission to address the community as a concerned military family. The crowd went silent as I connected my laptop to the projection system and began displaying surveillance footage of Patricia's contractors systematically sabotaging our property. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're seeing is documented evidence of criminal conspiracy, captured over the past month of federal investigation, I announced. The room erupted as people watched Patricia's hired thugs cutting electrical lines, damaging water systems, and destroying property while she coordinated from her BMW. Dad stood up and identified himself as FBI Special Agent Franklin Sterling. The authority in his voice cut through the crowd noise like a blade. I'm here to inform this community that the federal investigation into systematic civil rights violations, racketeering, and public corruption has resulted in multiple federal indictments. But the real showstopper was when Carl, the inspector, was walked into the room in handcuffs, escorted by DEA agents. The crowd gasped as they realized the man who'd condemned their neighbors' properties as safety hazards was himself a federal fugitive who'd been falsifying inspection reports for profit. She paid me to fake safety reports on properties she wanted to acquire, Carl announced to the packed room, his voice breaking with the weight of confession. Every violation, every condemnation order, every emergency demolition, it was all coordinated to steal lakefront property for her development project. That's when Patricia's composure finally cracked. She started screaming about government overreach and persecution of honest citizens, but her voice was drowned out by the crowd's reaction as they realized the scope of the conspiracy that had been terrorizing their community for years. Mom took the floor next, presenting her Treasury findings with the precision of a financial forensics expert. The defendant used her construction business to launder bribes, evade taxes on $380,000 in unreported income, and systematically defraud the federal government while harassing military families. 8 other targeted families stood up to give testimony about identical harassment campaigns. Business owners described economic intimidation, and the hardware store owner presented 4 years of documentation showing how Patricia had weaponized building supply access to pressure neighbors. The room atmosphere was electric, with the kind of justice that people rarely get to witness in person. This wasn't just about our cabin anymore. It was about an entire community realizing that the person they'd trusted with authority had been systematically abusing that trust for personal profit. Patricia made one final desperate attempt to maintain control. This is a vendetta by federal employees who can't accept legitimate community governance, she shouted. But her words were lost in the sound of handcuffs clicking as FBI agents moved in for the arrest. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent," Agent Rodriguez announced, and the entire room fell silent to hear Miranda rights read to their former HOA president. As they led Patricia away in handcuffs with news cameras capturing every moment, I delivered the line I'd been planning for months. "Ma'am, you demolished our family cabin thinking we were just another powerless military family. You forgot that we swore an oath to defend this Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Today, justice comes home." 8 months later, Patricia Manning was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, plus $3.7 million in restitution. The sound of that gavel falling echoed through a packed courtroom, where half of Lake Serenity had come to witness justice being served. Carl got 24 months and lost all professional licenses permanently. The county commissioner resigned in disgrace after pleading guilty to accepting bribes. But the real victory wasn't just putting criminals behind bars, it was watching an entire community heal from years of systematic abuse disguised as governance. The civil lawsuit settlement provided full compensation for our demolished cabin, plus punitive damages that sent a clear message about the cost of weaponizing bureaucracy against American families. Every targeted family received meaningful restitution, but more importantly, we'd established legal precedent that HOA harassment of military families would be prosecuted as federal civil rights violations. The new cabin we built rises from the same foundation where great-uncle's hands first shaped our family legacy, but it's bigger and better than the original. Modern safety features, accessibility upgrades, and a wraparound porch that can hold 4 generations of Sterlings during Sunday dinners. The smell of fresh cedar and lake breeze mixing with Mom's famous apple pie has replaced the diesel exhaust and fear that once poisoned this place. But the best part is watching community kids cannonball off our dock during summer afternoons, their squeals of joy mixing with the eagles calling across water that reflects nothing but blue sky and possibility. That's what lake property is supposed to be for, bringing families together, not tearing them apart through manufactured legal warfare. Lake Serenity dissolved the old HOA completely and established a new community organization with transparency requirements, term limits, and accountability measures. The Colorado legislature passed the Service Members HOA Protection Act, creating statewide legal protections based on our family's fight. Sometimes, one family's courage creates change that protects thousands of others. The Lake Serenity Veteran Scholarship Fund we established has become our proudest legacy. Every year we award college scholarships to military families who faced legal challenges while serving their country. The annual fundraising fishing tournament has grown into the community's biggest celebration, where the taste of fresh-caught trout mingles with the satisfaction of neighbors who learn to stand up for each other. Federal agencies created an HOA abuse task force, specifically for investigating similar cases, and our story inspired reform movements in 31 states. The documentary, When David Has a Federal Badge, turned our family's fight into a national conversation about protecting Americans from petty tyrants who hide behind official titles. Here's what every homeowner needs to remember. Always verify HOA legal standing through your Secretary of State database. Expired organizations can't legally enforce anything, but they'll keep trying until someone calls them on it. Document everything with timestamps when dealing with suspicious official actions, because proving conspiracy requires evidence of coordination. Most importantly, when local officials abuse authority for personal gain, it becomes federal crime with serious consequences. The system has tools to protect citizens from corruption. You just need to know which federal agencies to contact and have the courage to fight back when bullies think their badges make them untouchable. Next week, I'll tell you about my brother Jake's case involving a corrupt mayor who made the fatal mistake of threatening a federal drug enforcement agent. That story makes our HOA battle look like a warm-up exercise for what happens when you really poke the federal bear. But first, I want to hear your stories. Drop your HOA nightmare experiences in the comments below. We read every single one, and some of them become federal cases when families know their rights. Have you dealt with power-hungry board members who think they're running their own little kingdoms? Share those stories and let this community know they're not alone. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for HOA stories, where we show you how the system actually works when citizens understand how to make it work for justice, instead of letting petty tyrants run wild with manufactured authority. The evening breeze carries the sound of families laughing around lakefront fire pits, the crackle of burning cedar logs, and the gentle splash of fish jumping in water that belongs to everyone, not just those who think they have the right to steal it. This is what America looks like when good people refuse to let corruption win. Justice tastes like victory, sounds like community, and feels like coming home to a place where bullies can't survive the light of federal investigation. Thanks for being here with us at HOA Stories. If you enjoyed today's showdown and seeing an HOA Karen get put in her place, click like, sound off in the comments, and subscribe to catch next week's drama. You don't want to miss it.